Our speaker tonight is Fran Lavelle. She is a native of Ohio, and she is the director of the Department of Faith Formation for the Diocese of Jackson. She holds a D.Min., a Doctorate of Ministry and Transformation Leadership from Graduate Theological Foundation, and a Master's in
Pastoral.
Master in Pastoral Studies from Spring Hill College, the Jesuit School of the South.
Give it up.
When she is not busy with ministry, she enjoys life on the farm in Starkville with her husband David and her dog Pickles. Let's together welcome them.
Thank you. Thank you, Father David. What an incredible gift, and what a beautiful gathering tonight. What a beautiful gift of your presence. So thank you so much for being here tonight. I want to start off by just clarifying, because we talk about doppelgangers, that there are people that look like or remind us of somebody else, and I just want to clarify, not the same. not the same. It gets rough sometimes at the Kroger, but I usually handle it with a lot of grace. So tonight we're going to talk about grace, and one of the reasons, and this has certainly been something that has been on my mind and in ministry for the last several years, and I don't think I'm surprising anyone by saying that our discourse, both in the church and our theological areas and also in our civic areas, has become somewhat polarized. And I really believe that the church needs to lead us out of this polarization. And I think everybody in the room is old enough to remember when you didn't know what everyone ate for breakfast and what their belief was on any given subject. And those were nice days when Kelly in elementary school was just Kelly, and not all of a sudden I know every thought of Kelly's through social media, which can be very good. It can be used for a lot of good, but how do we break down those mechanisms and allow ourselves to see one another again? And grace is one of those things that I think can help us get there. I think of grace as something more than wall art. We've gotten to that place, and if you have a picture of grace on in your house, it's okay. I'm not coming for you. But when we use words like grace and art, or I have the wrought iron love in the flower rooms or my plant room, so I'm not outing anybody. But when things become more slogan or more jingoistic, then we kind of lose their meaning. Like, well, bless her heart. We all know what that means, right? Bless it. So being blessed takes on a different meaning, and grace can take on a different meaning if it's just seen through this one prism. So what I want to do is take a little deep dive theologically with grace, and the big issue here is, how do we embody it? Because first we have to embody it, and then we have to animate it, and that's true with any of the gifts that God gives us. And people have these gifts at every moment of every day at their dispense. But it's whether or not we have embodied it and then animate it that makes the difference. Does that make sense? Okay, well, that's where we're going tonight. The word from the Oxford Dictionary, grace is a simple noun, is simple elegance, refinement, movement. She moved through the water with effortless grace, or a courteous will. At least he had the grace to admit his debt to her. And then we have grace as a verb. Do honor or credit to someone or something by one's presence. She bowed out of the sport she had graced for 2 decades. So in our public world and in our public language or civic language, we use grace in those ways. But in the church, and this is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, grace is favor, free and undeserved help that God gives us to respond to his call to become children of God, adoptive sons, partakers of the divine nature and eternal life. Grace is a participation in the life of God. Let that last sentence just sort of resonate with you. Grace is a participation in the life of God. Now that's moved us into an embodied and then animated place. Grace is mentioned 170 times in the Bible. I should have asked that as a trivia question and then, thrown snacks at you if you got it right. But 170 times we hear about grace in the Bible. And these are just a few of my favorites from Romans 6:14. For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law but under grace. From Corinthians 15:10. But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. And then another favorite from Corinthians, and God is able to make all grace abound in you, so that having all sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. And that's what when I'm saying that grace is that these gifts, whether it's the gift of peace or grace or our blessedness or our holiness, they're always available to us, but they're not just, we have to respond to them. So as the Director of Faith Formation for the Diocese, I talk to catechists and DREs a lot about confirmation. And, when kids are being confirmed, yes, there's grace that happens in the moment of confirmation. But unless and until that individual is open to the grace and then accepts it and embodies it and then works through the grace, it's not a wasted grace. It's not something that God dispensed and then somehow we waited 15 years for Junior to get his life together. But that happens. But the grace is there, and it's there for us to awaken and to say yes to the graces that we're given. So I say every moment of your life is a graced moment. It's a grace-filled moment, every moment of your life. Because every moment of your life, God has put grace in your life, and from Corinthians, so that having all sufficiency in all good things at all times. So it's available at all times. We maybe have to reroute the way we think about it and process in the moment, where is the grace? So, from that catechism, can we agree that grace is the participation in the life of God? Is that a definition that you feel like I can get my head wrapped around that? Okay. One of my favorite quotes from Pope Francis: grace is not part of the consciousness. It is the amount of light in our souls, not the knowledge nor reason. So if you think of your soul as this vessel where you're letting the light of God in, that could be massive and cavernous, or it could be tiny, depending on how much we're willing to allow God's grace to be infused in us. And I think it's one of those things, like when you're aware of it, when you're aware of a gift or a grace or like grace, then the more you're able to access it. Have you heard of the law of attraction? So this happened with me with hawks, of all things. One day I was on a walk and I saw a hawk, and I was like, man, that's a beautiful hawk. It's a little, hanging out in the tree, probably ready to go eat a baby rabbit. I don't know. And I noticed that when I was driving, I would see hawks, and I'm on I-55, and I look up and on a line but my mind has been trained to see it's the law of attraction. Because it's something that I appreciate in nature, I'm more apt to see it. If you've ever been out on a hike with somebody who loves, I used to date a guy that loved tree frogs, don't hate. But he would find all of these interesting tree frogs that most of us probably just walked by the tree, but he had trained his mind to see it. He had trained his eye to look for these beautiful little frogs on the tree bark. And that's the same with the gifts that God gives us, and grace is one of those. We have to train our hearts and we train our minds to see those moments where grace can really be manifested, where we could really animate God's grace in the world. So I was thinking about the Trinity in terms of this, that we think of God in the Trinity as creator, redeemer, and sanctifier. And we think of in those three, in the attributes of God, as love, mercy, and grace. Creator, creating the world out of love, redeemer, mercy, and then sanctifier as grace. So real grace, like real mercy and real love, takes work. And one of the things I think in our culture today is that oftentimes if those become, wall art, then we lose that it really is, it takes a lot of work to, love is hard, mercy is difficult, and so is grace. So I'm going to show a little video. How many of you have watched the movie Amazing Grace? Have you watched? Okay. However you get your movies these days, streamed or DVD players, I don't know how this happens anymore for most people. I'm just getting on the streaming train, but you've got to see that movie. We all know the story, right? We all know the story of the song Amazing Grace. But this really unwraps and that's another term. Like when I was looking at that term, if you Google the images for Amazing Grace, you get it in beautiful script and they're little tulips, and it's this pretty little idea of grace. And when we know this story, and we know the story of grace takes perseverance, and it takes a lot of deep belief. So we're going to take a little look at Pardon me. So as you saw in that little video clip, the journey to the end of the slave trade was an arduous one, and the perseverance that is required to make that journey happen took over several years. And the story of John Newton. So this is the next part of the story.
By the late 1700s, British slavers were capturing as many as 50,000 Africans each year and taking them to the Americas. So how did this enslavement of Africans come to an end? In the United States, it would take a civil war. In the British Empire, it would take a movement that included a man named William Wilberforce. While slavers were seeking slaves in Africa in the late 1700s, William Wilberforce was living in luxury in his family's estates in London and Wimbledon. Then he spent a few years gambling and dining with friends on the finest foods at college in Cambridge. Years earlier, he'd been fascinated by a young preacher named George Whitefield, but now all he wanted was a seat in the British Parliament. In 1780, when he was only 21 years old, Wilberforce got his position in Parliament. During his early years of service, William, in his own words, did nothing to any purpose. My own distinction was my darling object. Then in 1785, while on a trip across Europe, the emptiness of William's plush life began to gnaw at his soul. Finally, in the spring of 1786, following months of dark depression, William Wilberforce trusted Jesus Christ alone to transform his troubled soul. As a new believer, he thought about abandoning his political position, but John Newton, the ex-slave trader who had penned the hymn Amazing Grace, urged Wilberforce to use his parliamentary position for the glory of God. A few months later, Wilberforce received a letter urging him to work to end British slave trafficking, and he began to turn his efforts toward this goal. Now, despite his personal charm, Wilberforce was a clumsy political strategist at times. He and his friend Thomas Clarkson introduced legislation to limit the slave trade in 1789, 1791, 1792, 93, 97, 98, 99, 1804, and 1805, only to be defeated every time. Opposition to Wilberforce became so fierce that one friend feared he would be barbecued by African merchants and eaten by Guinea captains. Finally, in 1807, the efforts of Wilberforce and Clarkson combined with the news of a slave uprising on an island known as Haiti to turn the tide. Parliament outlawed the slave trade in the British Empire. The circle around Wilberforce then turned their efforts toward abolishing slavery itself. Poor health forced Wilberforce to resign from Parliament, but Clarkson and others continued this campaign. In July of 1833, 3 days before William Wilberforce died, it became clear that they had the votes they needed to end slavery in the British Empire. The next month, the House of Lords passed the Slavery Abolition Act. 30 years later, slaves were emancipated in the United States as well. Christians rightly celebrate the impact of faith on the abolition of African slavery, but it's important never to forget that slavery didn't go away in the 19th century. In fact, in the opening decades of the 21st century, at least 12 million human beings live in slavery. Each year, more than 500,000 men, women, and children are transported as slaves across international borders. 70% are female, half are minors. May God raise up a new generation of men and women like William Wilberforce to bring an end to slavery in this century as well.
What I think is so fascinating about William Wilberforce's story is that the persistence of the grace that God gave him in understanding that he was called to do something and that he continued on that journey despite defeat. And I don't know who to attribute it to. I'm sure someone here does, but the mark of a true person is not how many times you get knocked down, it's how many times you get back up. And that for every time that he was knocked down, he got back up because he utilized the grace that had been given to him. He embodied it, and then he was able to animate it. So grace empowers us to be agents of transformation. And I saw a video clip on the interwebs today or yesterday, and it was a psychologist from Australia, and she was talking about how, in 2124, we will not even be a memory. that no one is going to know where our furniture and our clothing and our photo books. And she was her point in saying this was, that we really have to enjoy our life and not worry so much, and take time to take care of ourselves and have a life. But as I was reflecting on that in my prayer time, I thought, what we do in our life, even every day, we're changing and shifting the winds, that there's something that we can bring today that's going to change the life of somebody tomorrow. And it doesn't matter if they don't remember my name in 2124. What matters was that I used the life that God has given me to make life better for the next generation, or to change something that allows others to have deeper spiritual growth or a better life. And that really is the story of Wilberforce, to use the grace that we're given. It doesn't particularly matter to me when I'm gone, obviously, but it doesn't matter to me those ripples that are being made. What matters is that I continue to make those ripples. So for one of the things that I didn't put in my bio is that I came to Mississippi in 1999 to be the campus minister at Mississippi State for the Catholic students there, and I was there for 15 years before I took my job at the Chancery. And I would pray often, God, I don't need to know the good that I do, but make me aware if there's one little heart that I have in some way injured or in some way turned away from you, to know that we leave. And those of you, how many teachers do I have in the room, or former teachers? You know how it feels when you come home, or anyone that's in a caring industry, when you come home and you've just got, I call it fingerprints all over your heart. Like your heart is just covered with other people's fingerprints because you've spent a day in that loving touch with someone else. Both Newton and Wilberforce, Newton wrote about his experience. He wrote the song Amazing Grace and about his conversion. But Wilberforce used that experience to change human history. And we all have the power to do that. I mean, that's the really brilliant part about God's gift of life, is that we all, no matter what our station, no matter what our age, no matter what socioeconomic class we belong to, gender, anything, that we all have the power within us to make a difference. And will it be written in the history books like their story? Maybe so, maybe not. But it absolutely does, through God's grace, make a difference in the life of the world. And you have the power to be that change. We know that whatever evil that is not transformed will be transferred. And you see that in places that human nature is so human that we can't get over whatever tribal things or difficult things that separate us.
When you reach the plantation, they put irons to the fire and do this to let you know that you no longer belong to God, but to a man.
Mr. Wilberforce, we understand you're having problems choosing whether to do the work of God or the work of a political activist.
We humbly suggest that you can do both.
That's a powerful part in the movie, when there are times when we feel like we're challenged to be one thing or the other, or what difference can I make? What is my voice lending to something? I can only do this because of my role or my station in life. But we can be more than that. You can do both. You can serve God and serve your community. You can serve God and your family. You can serve God and the corporate job that you have, or the job that you have at school, or what have you. How many friends of St. Teresa of Lisieux are in the room? You can shout it out if you love her. Okay, we've got one strong member of the family. This just so sums up grace for me. It's a beautiful quote. It's a beautiful prayer. Everything is a grace. Everything is the direct effect of our Father's love. Difficulties, contradictions, humiliations, all the soul's miseries, her burdens, her needs, everything. Because through them, she learns humility, realizes her weakness. Everything is a grace because everything is God's gift. Whatever be the character of life or its unexpected events, to the heart that loves, all is well. And I don't think that she's glossing over the difficult times. I don't think that she's, that this is some sort of toxic positivity from Teresa of Lisieux. I think really what she's saying in that is that even in our darkest hour, 10,000 graces come from the most difficult thing you've ever done in your life. But we have to have the eyes of faith to see them. In my life, my father died of a massive coronary in front of 250 people. And my mother was mortified by that for the longest time. She was mortified by the fact that 250 people saw your dad die. And I said, Mother, if one person went home and reconciled a relationship with a family member or a friend who they had been estranged from, graces came from that one moment. And we don't know how many stories come out of the difficulties of our lives. We don't know when we persevere through those difficult times. And like I said, not in a toxic positive way, but in a way that is true to your understanding of God's love in your life. We don't know the rest of the story. Despite the good theology that the church has on grace, we can still be pretty stingy. So whatever people are consumed by, whether it's anger, envy, resentment, then that comes out in the way that we live. And that's one of the things I was referring to earlier, what we see in social media. And you're just sort of sometimes like, do I really know you? And the answer is, well, I do now. So if you're consumed by those things, then those are the things that come out in your life. And when you're consumed by love, mercy, and grace, when you really take the opportunity to take that in, then that's what is manifested and that's what comes out in your life. I had, when I was a campus minister, I had a book club in the summer one year. And a graduate student, Kendra, was in the club. And there was a girl, Sarah. And Sarah never read the book. She never read one chapter of the book, but she came to book club every week. Are there any Sarahs in the room? Do we know people that come to book club and haven't read? So Kendra was just this very kind person, but it got to her because every week Sarah would say, well, what I think the author's saying is, and we all knew that she had confessed that she hadn't read it. And so poor Kendra is just holding in this tension of really wanting to let her have it. And so one day she gracefully said, Sarah, I'm going to respectfully ask you to not comment on what the author thinks until you actually read what the author wrote. And afterwards I said, Kendra, I just want to, thank you for that because you handled that so beautifully. And she said, Fran, my grandma had a little phrase she'd say with us, EGR, baby, EGR. Extra grace required. So there are going to be people in our lives, and they can be the people that you can sleep next to at night, or drive into school in the carpool in the morning. They can be people that are in our lives every day that you just know that there's a little extra grace required. In our human nature, one of the things that was the funny thing about leaving the corporate and public world and coming into ministry about 30 years ago was I thought everybody was going to be nice and like each other. I know. Isn't that cute? I was like, I'm going to work for the church and we're all going to love each other and it's just going to be awesome. And then the same people that were difficult, they manifested into different body. But we're always going to have difficult people in our life. It's how we learn to cope, and cope is probably not the right word, how we learn to not let their difficulties change us. That's the big question, is am I going to let this change who I am? Or am I going to take this moment and make it a grace-filled moment and manifest something else? So be like Kendra. To give grace, we first have to slow down enough to realize the situations that need grace and to treat others with the compassion that God shows for us And we have to be sure to model grace to our children. I believe that my, what is it called, battery. My battery just died. EGR, people? Okay, I'll be really, is this loud enough? Because I know I'm a little delicate flower. Well, it feels like it's back. It was a miracle. Woo! Who are you channeling back there, sir? The grace of God. It was the grace of God. Okay, and I'm going to pretend like none of the audiovisual hiccups that we've had tonight actually happened. So if they ever come up in a meeting, or I don't know, did that happen to that lady? I don't think so. So back to it, and to be sure to model grace to our children in those situations that they can understand what is grace. And so today we ask ourselves, how am I modeling grace? And that is also part of this hopped up vitrolic world that we live in. You know, if you're posting things on social media that your kids are going to be able to read at some point, whether they're readers now or not, what messages are you telling them? And how much of a contradiction is that to what we say on Sunday morning? And I think just kind of reimagining who we are in our humanity would help us with that, reimagining our own dignity, and then extending that love and dignity to the other. It's so incredibly important. So a little story about a rock, a window, and a moment of grace. I was on my way to the office. It's okay. I was on my way to the office, it was back in September, and I'm at a light, and there's a gentleman who has got the weed whacker, and he is trimming along one of the streets in Jackson, and he threw a rock. And the rock hit my window. And honestly, no shade thrown here, but I'm in Jackson, Mississippi. I thought it was a gunshot. And it kind of took me for a second. Thank you, Father. Full service priest. It took me for a minute. I was shocked, and I realized it was your window. And so I put it in park, and I see the guy he's booking down the way. Now, I know as a some-year-old person that this could go a lot of different ways, but I felt like I needed to get out of the car and address the situation. My husband felt differently after I told him the story, but it worked out. So he turns around and he's coming back, and I said, "Excuse me, sir, but when you were down here on the corner, you threw a rock and you blew out my window." And he said, "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Let me get my supervisor. We have a guy that takes care of this." So I'm thinking to myself, how often are you blowing out people's windows? But I didn't let that affect the rest of the story. So I said, okay, could you move your car? I moved the car. In the meantime, one of my colleagues drives by. She's called not the 911, but the other police that just come for things like this. And so the Capitol Police shows up, and she's like, "Ma'am, are you okay?" I said, "Yes, I'm okay." And the gentleman said, "We're going to take care of this. You don't need to write up a report." So here's trusting Fran going, "Yeah, go. You don't need to write up a report. We got this." So the Capitol Police leaves. And the gentleman's supervisor comes. He calls Venable Glass. He sets up an appointment. He says, "Be there at 1 o'clock. It'll be replaced today. We're so sorry that this took up your time this morning. Have a nice day." While I was standing there was a road crew. Some gentlemen came over, and they said, "Excuse me, ma'am. You look very tired and hot. Can we bring you some water from our truck?" I said, "No, thank you, sir. I think I'll be okay. I'm just waiting for a minute for this gentleman's supervisor." "Well, we saw what happened. If you need witnesses." "Oh, I don't think we need witnesses." My point in telling the story, which it did end up perfect. I mean, I went to Venable Glass that day. An hour later, I have a new window in my car, or driver's side window is replaced. How many opportunities, and I'm not saying this because I think I'm awesome, although others would say. But I'm saying this because how many situations how could have that gone 1,000 different ways wrong? From my attitude to the attitude of the gentleman who threw the rock, to whether his supervisor was kind, to the people at Venable, to the men who came over from across the way that were working patching holes. For so many ways this thing could have gone wrong. And it's in those moments when that stuff happens that we have to have that clarity in our minds to say, wait a minute, we are covered up in a world of Karens. I accidentally, last summer, started watching Karen videos, and I can't stop. They're the videos of and they're usually white women who go off on people in an ugly way. It doesn't look good for women or white people. It just doesn't. And I started watching these Karen videos, and I was like, when are we going to start recording grace videos? When are we going to start recording the videos of this is somebody that was kind and in a tough situation, but that's not what's going to make the TikTok world, and that's not going to want to get 4 million likes. So in a world of Karens, be a grace. This is the famous Karen who called the cops on a gentleman for walking his dog in Central Park, just for being there. So you're wondering, you know the story, how it ended. And I think this is something we can take for ourselves as we go into the world, that our perseverance and our dedication to animate the life of grace in our lives, that it doesn't always work out the first time, but in the end, more grace abounds.
Order! Order! On the Home and Foreign Slave Trade Act, the unamended bill calling for the abolition of the slave trade throughout the entire British Empire.
Noes to the left, 16. Ayes to the right, 283.
I declare the bill of abolition of the slave trade to be passed.
Noblesse oblige.
What the bloody hell does that mean?
It means my nobility obliges me to recognize the virtue of an exceptional commoner.
When people speak of great men, they think of men like Napoleon, men of violence. Rarely do they think of peaceful men. But contrast the reception they'll receive when they return home from their battles. Napoleon will arrive in pomp and in power, a man who's achieved the very summit of earthly ambition. And yet his dreams will be haunted by the oppressions of war. William Wilberforce, however, will return to his family, lay his head on his pillow, and remember, the slave trade is no more.
part of what is captivating in the end of that story is in the quote of his friend, that oftentimes we remember the people who were great warriors in history, and ordinary people that live extraordinary lives. And I mean, his is recorded in history, but ordinary people that live extraordinary lives and captivate history in a moment oftentimes are not written down in the annals. They're oftentimes not they're not recorded in history books. But the fact that we were here and we took advantage of the moments that God has given us to be grace-filled and to bring dignity and mercy and love to whatever little corner of the world we have or whatever people we have to influence is the best lived life. So that's my wish for you, and also for a good and holy Lent. One of my favorite Teddy Roosevelt quotes is, "No one cares how much you know until they know how much you care." And so I leave you as we get questions or what have you. Thank you.
Since Fran is so willing to take questions, we'll allow her to do so. We will ask her to repeat the question, and that's because she's wearing Sister Rose's mic. That allows
Sister Rose
what she says to be heard on camera, but that mic also excludes all the other background noise. So this way, people who are watching on YouTube later will be able to hear what the question was, as well as the answer. So yes, she did hear you, but that's why she's repeating.
Thank you very much. And the idea of people watching this on YouTube later is also very exciting. Anyone? I'm going to give you a... Thank you, love.
Hi. I don't really have a question, but one of the things you said in the beginning is that you have to recognize the moments of grace.
Yes.
And sometimes that's hard for people to learn how to do. So do you have any suggestions?
She's asked for suggestions that I mentioned in the beginning, that we have to look for those moments of grace, and do I have suggestions on how to do that? And it really goes back to that law of attraction. So you train your mind through. How many of you have a very strict order of morning prayer, that you do the same thing every morning? When you have and I'm not saying discipline like the rest of you are wild, feral Catholics, but when you have a discipline like morning prayer and silence, it does help center you for the day. And so oftentimes I just refer to it as my quiet time. In my quiet time, sometimes somebody will come to mind. There was a young man who committed suicide when I was in high school that was in my graduating class, and Eddie's name will come to me. And so I just offer Eddie and his family up in prayer, and sometimes it'll be an idea for work, and other times it's just quiet time. But when you have that practice of just being present, and it doesn't have to be a long time, 5 or 10 minutes of no noise. And I know for a lot of folks it's hard. Probably 20 years ago I stopped turning on the radio in the car, that when I'm driving, and I do a lot of driving between Starkville and Jackson, that I drive in silence. So it's taking time to be quiet helps you hear and see things that otherwise we might miss. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
Is there a prayer that you use specifically to help you recognize those graces?
He's asked if there's a prayer I use specifically that helps me recognize those graces. The breastplate of St. Patrick. There's a song that has been written called "The Deer's Cry." I don't know, Sean Davies sings that, but it's beautifully put to music, the words of St. Patrick's breastplate. I rise today, through the grace of heaven. And it's putting Christ before us, beneath us, above us, around us, sort of surrounding ourselves in the presence of Christ. So that is one of my favorites. And sometimes, it depends on how long you've done contemplative work within yourself. Sometimes it's just, a one word or a phrase, Jesus, I love you, or come Holy Spirit. That's always a good one. Come Holy Spirit, come. and then just be present. And that definitely helps. And I think on the day of the breaking of the window, probably I hadn't had any coffee yet. So that probably configured into my ability to be the Zen master that I was. Jack me up on a little caffeine and do that, and it might have come down differently, you know. Anyone else? I love this, by the way. If I lived closer, I'd be having cocktails and Catholics all the time with you, because it's lovely. It's a lovely gathering, and good to see so many people out tonight. So I thank you so much for being here. And one more question in the back.
It seems that what we've been talking about so far has just been a moment in time. Is this cumulative, or what's the big picture?
Can you help me refine that? I'm not.
I mean, you were getting through an episode of something that was going wrong, or
right.
Whatever. But I mean, if you just kind of life up, this.
Oh, I think so. He's asking, is there an accumulative effect of sort of this presence and this, being present to grace? And I think it is true that you more readily come to see it, because you've sort of trained your spirituality leans towards that. So I do think it goes back to that, what we consume. So if we're consuming anger and resentment and those sort of things, and that's what's going to come out in us. And so when we're consuming the grace and love and peace, I love that Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." He didn't say peacekeepers. Making peace is work. Being a Catholic, being a Christian is work. And so when you there, it does get easier to see the graces, because you're sort of attuned to them. And my dad died it's been 30 years. So I really feel like that probably set me on this journey, and probably is the reason why I never lost my faith, because I was, he was my best friend. I was so devastated that to be able to see the grace that he taught up into the last minute of his life, he was giving his life to humanity up until he died. Because we do know that good things came out of that. Now, would I rather have him back and be drinking a Stroh's or Hudipole from Cincinnati, Ohio? Probably yes, but I can look back and see the grace, and that's the important thing, is in those times, and then it will help you see the grace in the little things too. So thank you for that. It was a good question.
Once again, thank you, Fran, for being with us tonight.